Comfort rarely announces itself as a threat. It doesn't arrive with warning signs. It doesn't feel dangerous. It doesn't create urgency. Comfort feels earned. It feels like the reward for effort, for endurance, for getting through difficult phases without falling apart. Comfort feels like something that should be protected, and that is exactly why it works. Most people associate danger with instability, with chaos, with uncertainty, with things falling apart. Comfort looks like the opposite of that. It looks like order, like control, like things finally making sense. Nothing feels wrong. Days are predictable. Systems function. Responsibilities are manageable. There is a rhythm to life.
And a rhythm is soothing. It removes friction. It reduces decision-making. It creates the sense that nothing urgent is being neglected. This is why comfort rarely feels suspicious. It feels like progress. After all, isn't this what people are working toward? A life that runs smoothly. A life without constant disruption. A life where effort finally decreases. Comfort answers a very real need. The need to rest, the need to recover, the need to stop reacting to everything. But comfort does not know when to stop. It does not distinguish between rest and retreat. It simply reduces movement. At first, this reduction feels intentional. You choose familiar routines. You choose known environments. You choose what requires less energy. These choices feel rational. They feel aligned with experience, with maturity, with knowing what works, and often they are. The problem is not comfort itself. The problem is duration. Comfort is useful in phases. It allows recovery. It restores stability. It gives the nervous system space to settle. But when comfort becomes the default state, it quietly begins to narrow life. Not abruptly, not dramatically, gradually. Choices begin to filter themselves, not because options are gone, but because they feel unnecessary. Certain invitations no longer register. Certain possibilities no longer feel realistic. Not impossible, just impractical. Comfort reduces appetite for the unknown. It replaces curiosity with familiarity, exploration with repetition, and repetition feels safe. Safety is deeply attractive, especially after years of managing uncertainty, especially after learning how fragile things can be. Comfort promises continuity. It promises that nothing will demand more than you can give, and that promise is hard to resist. Over time, comfort begins to reshape perception. What once felt like a choice starts to feel like a boundary, not because it is enforced, but because it is rarely questioned. The mind adjusts to reduced range without complaint. It recalibrates expectations. It simplifies desire. It narrows attention, all in the name of stability. And stability feels virtuous. It feels responsible. It feels grown up. It feels like something that should not be disturbed. This is how comfort moves from being helpful to being protective. Not protective of growth, but protective of the existing shape of life. The shape becomes familiar, familiarity becomes reassuring, and reassurance becomes the priority. Change, when it appears, begins to feel intrusive, not threatening, just inconvenient. It interrupts flow. It introduces uncertainty. It asks for attention, and attention is something comfort tries to minimize. So change is postponed, not rejected, just delayed. And delays, when repeated, have a way of becoming permanent. Comfort does not need to convince you. It only needs to make staying feel easier than moving, and most of the time, that is enough. EP2, Part 2. Comfort does not confine people by force. It confines them by preference. It makes staying feel reasonable. It makes leaving feel excessive. Over time, this preference begins to organize life, not consciously, but quietly. Decisions stop being evaluated on their potential. They are evaluated on how much disruption they introduce. The question shifts, not, is this meaningful, but, is this necessary? Comfort reframes value. What expands life begins to look optional. What maintains order begins to look essential. This is how a boundary forms without ever being named. At first, nothing feels restricted. Life still contains movement, just less of it. Options still exist. They are simply less attractive. The mind learns to prioritize ease over range. Ease reduces effort. Ease reduces uncertainty. Ease reduces exposure. And exposure is where growth lives. But growth is rarely urgent. Maintenance is. Comfort aligns perfectly with maintenance. It supports continuity. It protects structure. It rewards predictability. And predictability feels like safety. Safety is powerful. It calms the nervous system. It lowers vigilance. It allows attention to relax. But relaxed attention also notices less. The world becomes smaller, not because it changed, but because less of it is being perceived. This narrowing does not feel like loss. It feels like focus. Focus is praised. Focus is productive. Focus is efficient. But focus without expansion becomes fixation, and fixation is rigid. Rigid systems do not adapt well. They resist interruption. They avoid friction. They protect what exists. Comfort strengthens this rigidity by rewarding consistency. Doing the same things the same way begins to feel correct. Deviation feels wrong. Not dangerous, just unnecessary. This is where comfort becomes a cage. Not because it locks doors, but because it removes the desire to open them. When movement decreases, imagination follows. Possible futures feel distant. Alternative selves feel unrealistic. Not impossible, just unlikely. The mind prefers what it can already predict. Prediction feels like control. Control reduces anxiety, and reduced anxiety feels like success, especially for people who have spent years managing instability. Comfort promises relief from vigilance. It says, you don't have to watch so closely anymore. And that promise is seductive, because watching takes effort. Attention is work. Questioning is work. Reevaluating long-standing choices is work. Comfort minimizes work. It smooths decisions before they reach awareness. Paths are filtered automatically. Opportunities that require adaptation fade quietly from consideration, not because they are rejected, but because they are never fully seen. This is how the cage becomes invisible. It does not feel imposed. It feels earned. I've done enough. I don't need more. This works. These statements feel grounded. They sound like clarity. But clarity can sometimes be compressed vision. Seeing fewer options is easier than holding many. Comfort encourages this simplification. It trades possibility for certainty. And certainty is calming. But certainty also limits growth. Growth thrives in ambiguity. It requires uncertainty. It requires exposure to what cannot be fully controlled. Comfort resists this. It prefers what is known, what has precedent, what fits within existing patterns. Over time, life becomes a system to preserve, not a field to explore. Preservation is subtle. It does not announce itself. It does not demand loyalty. It simply becomes default. Change, when it appears, feels disruptive to something that is finally working, and working systems are protected even when they no longer grow. This is how comfort turns into a cage without ever feeling cruel. It does not punish movement. It simply makes stillness more comfortable. And for most people, that is enough to stop them from noticing what they have slowly given up. The long-term cost of comfort is rarely visible. It does not arrive as pain. It does not demand attention. It does not interrupt daily life. It accumulates quietly. Comfort does not take something away all at once. It reduces range incrementally. What is lost is not stability. It is optionality, the ability to move differently, to choose differently, to respond when conditions change. At first, this loss feels insignificant. After all, why need options that are never used? Unused capacity feels wasteful. Efficiency rewards what is immediately useful, and comfort aligns with efficiency. But optionality is not about immediate use. It is about resilience. A life with options can adapt. A life without them must endure. Endurance looks strong from the outside, but it is costly. It requires suppression. It requires tolerance. It requires accepting limitation without complaint. Comfort encourages this endurance by making limitation feel reasonable. When range narrows, adaptation slows. Change becomes harder, not because it is impossible, but because the muscles that support it have weakened. Flexibility is like strength. It fades when unused. Comfort minimizes strain. It removes the need to stretch, to adjust, to respond to unfamiliar demands. Over time, this absence of strain produces fragility. Not obvious fragility, hidden fragility. Systems appear solid, routines function, life remains orderly. But when disruption arrives, there is little room to maneuver. Everything depends on continuity, and continuity is never guaranteed. The world does not stay still. Conditions shift, contexts change, demands evolve. A life built entirely around comfort struggles to absorb these shifts, not because the person is incapable, but because the structure has no flexibility left. This is one of the quiet paradoxes of comfort. It promises safety, but it reduces resilience. Resilience requires exposure. It requires moments of uncertainty, of adjustment, of effort without guarantee. Comfort avoids these moments. It prioritizes smoothness, predictability, consistency. And consistency is comforting, but consistency without challenge becomes brittle. When everything works only under specific conditions, any deviation feels threatening. The response to disruption becomes defensive. Protect the system, maintain order, restore what was, rather than adapt to what is. This defensive posture limits perception. The mind becomes focused on preservation, not exploration. Problems are framed as interruptions. Opportunities are framed as risks. Anything unfamiliar is treated cautiously. Comfort teaches this framing over time. It trains attention to favor the known, and what is favored is repeated. What is repeated becomes dominant. Eventually, life becomes optimized for a narrow range of experiences. Outside that range, everything feels expensive, not in money, in energy, inattention, in emotional cost. The idea of expanding again feels overwhelming, not because expansion is harmful, but because the capacity to expand has not been exercised. This is how comfort creates long-term limitation without immediate consequence. Nothing breaks, nothing fails, but adaptation slows. And when adaptation slows, the future narrows. Not suddenly, gradually, quietly, in ways that are difficult to reverse once they are noticed. This is the real cost of comfort. Not that it feels good, but that it feels good enough to stop movement. Comfort changes how the future is perceived. Not directly, not deliberately, quietly. When life feels manageable, the future stops being examined. It becomes an extension of the present. Tomorrow is expected to look like today. Next year is expected to follow the same structure. The mind stops imagining radically different outcomes, not because imagination is gone, but because it feels unnecessary. Comfort reduces urgency to look ahead. If things are working now, why question what comes next? The future feels stable by default, and stability feels reassuring. But reassurance can dull foresight. Long-term thinking requires tension. It requires asking what happens if conditions change, if energy shifts, if priorities evolve. Comfort avoids these questions. They feel abstract, they feel distant, they feel like problems for another time. So the future becomes vague, not frightening, just undefined. Undefined futures are easy to ignore. They do not demand action. They do not demand preparation. They simply remain somewhere ahead. And without attention, they do not develop shape. This is how comfort creates temporal blindness. People stop noticing where their life is heading. They focus on maintaining where it already is. Direction is replaced by momentum. Momentum feels powerful. It gives the illusion of progress. But momentum without direction is simply movement without intention. Life continues forward because time does, not because a path has been chosen. Comfort supports this illusion. As long as systems hold, the question of direction feels unnecessary. But direction does not disappear. It becomes implicit. The future is decided by default settings, by habits, by routines, by assumptions that have not been updated. What is not questioned becomes destiny, not because it was chosen, but because it was left alone. Comfort encourages this passivity. It rewards staying within familiar trajectories. It discourages imagining disruptive futures. They do not demand action. They do not demand preparation. They simply remain somewhere ahead. And without attention, they do not develop shape. This is how comfort creates temporal blindness. People stop noticing where their life is heading. They focus on maintaining where it already is. Direction is replaced by momentum. Momentum feels powerful. It gives the illusion of progress. But momentum without direction is simply movement without intention. Life continues forward because time does, not because a path has been chosen. Comfort supports this illusion. As long as systems hold, the question of direction feels unnecessary. But direction does not disappear. It becomes implicit. The future is decided by default settings, by habits, by routines, by assumptions that have not been updated. What is not questioned becomes destiny, not because it was chosen, but because it was left alone. Comfort encourages this passivity. It rewards staying within familiar trajectories. It discourages imagining disruptive futures, not because they are dangerous, but because they feel unrealistic. Unrealistic futures are easy to dismiss. They do not fit the current structure. they would require too much change, too much uncertainty, too much disruption to what already works. So they are set aside. The mind learns to imagine the future only within safe boundaries, boundaries defined by the present. This narrowing of imagination is subtle. It does not feel like loss. It feels like realism. People say they are simply being practical, that dreaming is for earlier phases, that life is about maintenance now. Sometimes that is true, but sometimes it is not realism. It is resignation disguised as maturity. Comfort helps maintain this disguise. It softens dissatisfaction. It numbs restlessness. It quiets questions before they fully form. The future becomes less a space of possibility and more a continuation to be managed. Planning replaces imagining. Logistics replace vision. The future becomes a checklist. Retirement, responsibilities, arrangements, necessary considerations, but not sufficient ones. Without imagination, the future has no depth. It becomes something to endure, not something to grow into. Comfort makes this tolerable. It removes the discomfort of confronting unknown futures, but it also removes the energy that comes from anticipation. Anticipation requires openness. It requires uncertainty. Comfort closes that space. It trades anticipation for predictability, and predictability feels safer. But safety is not direction. A life can feel safe and still drift. Drift does not announce itself. It feels like continuity. Days pass, years accumulate, and the future arrives without having been imagined. This is how comfort disconnects people from where they are going, not by forcing stillness, but by making movement feel unnecessary. EP2, Part 5. Comfort does not feel like a mistake. It feels like an arrival, a place where effort finally decreases, where vigilance softens, where nothing urgent demands attention. And that is why it is rarely questioned. Comfort does not argue for itself. It does not persuade. It simply remains available, always nearby. When life becomes tiring, comfort offers rest. When uncertainty feels heavy, comfort offers familiarity. When questions feel complicated, comfort offers quiet. None of this feels wrong. In fact, it feels reasonable, and reason is powerful. Reason tells us to protect what works, to avoid unnecessary disruption, to preserve stability. Comfort fits neatly inside this logic. It presents itself as the sensible choice, and so it stays. Not because it is chosen again and again, but because it is never explicitly left. Leaving comfort would require noticing what it has slowly replaced. It would require attention, and attention is what comfort has been quietly reducing. Over time, life adapts to this reduction. Expectations soften. Desire simplifies. Ambition becomes modest. Not because ambition was wrong, but because it feels less necessary. The edges of life smooth out. Days blend. Weeks repeat. Years pass without much friction. This smoothness is easy to mistake for peace. Peace suggests resolution, that something has been settled. But peace without awareness can become numbness. Not dramatic numbness, just the absence of contrast. When contrast fades, experience flattens.
Moments feel similar. Time accelerates. Life feels shorter, not because it is empty, but because less of it stands out. Comfort allows this without resistance. It asks nothing, it demands nothing. It simply continues to soften the space around experience until the space itself becomes smaller. This shrinking does not announce itself as loss. It arrives as calm, as predictability, as familiarity. And because nothing hurts, nothing is questioned. People continue. They maintain routines, they maintain roles, they maintain a life that functions, and functioning feels sufficient. There is no obvious reason to disturb it, so it remains. Comfort settles in as the background condition of life, not oppressive, not dramatic, just present. And within that presence, movement slows. Not completely, just enough to be unnoticeable. The future continues to arrive. But it arrives already shaped by habits, by assumptions, by choices that were never revisited. Nothing collapses, nothing demands change. Life simply proceeds along the path that requires the least attention. And the thought does not conclude. It lingers, quietly, waiting.